The bags were black. The kind you use for leaves in October, or for clearing out a garage after someone dies. There were 6 of them, lined up along the front path like they'd been placed with intention, not thrown, not dropped, but arranged. My dress shirts were visible through the thin plastic of the nearest one, folded wrong, sleeves bent at angles that made them look broken. I'm Daniel. 41 years old. I design load-bearing structures for a living. I calculate exactly how much weight a thing can hold before it fails. I had never once applied that thinking to my marriage. I sat in my truck for a moment before getting out. The engine was still running. It was a Tuesday in early March, 6:18 in the evening, and the sky over Greenfield had that particular gray-white quality it gets before a cold rain. The oak tree in our front yard, the one Owen had tried to climb last summer and scraped both knees on, was bare. Everything looked bare. The porch light was on. The curtain in the front window moved once, then was still. I turned off the engine. My name is on the deed to this house. Both names are, actually, Daniel Marsh and Claire Marsh, typed in clean black letters on a document I'd last seen in the fireproof lockbox in the basement closet. We'd bought this house 11 years ago, 8 months after Owen was born, when Claire was still doing freelance design work from the dining room table and I had just been promoted to senior engineer at Hargrove and Associates. We'd stood in the empty living room together, our voices echoing off bare walls, and she'd said it smells like possibility and I'd laughed because only Claire said things like that and meant them completely. I got out of the truck. The grass was soft under my boots, still wet from the morning. I crouched down next to the nearest bag and pulled the plastic apart at the knot. My gray blazer was inside, pressed against a tangle of charging cables and 2 framed photographs, one of Owen at age 5, gap-toothed and proud, and one of Claire and me at her sister's wedding in Savannah. We looked young in that photo. We looked like people who had no idea what was coming. I stood up slowly. The front door opened before I reached the porch steps. Claire stood in the doorway in a cream-colored sweater I'd never seen before, arms folded, her dark hair pulled back. She looked composed. That was the word that came to me instantly, not angry, not guilty, not sad. Composed. Like she had rehearsed this moment and decided exactly which version of herself to present for it. "I've spoken to a lawyer," she said. No greeting. No hesitation. Just that sentence, delivered in the tone she used when she'd already made a decision and was informing me of it rather than discussing it. Something shifted in my chest, not pain yet, not quite. Something older than pain. The particular cold of being made a stranger in the place you thought was yours. "The bags are a bit much," I said. She didn't respond to that. "Owen's at Patrice's until 8, she added. "I thought it was better he wasn't here." I looked at the bags on the lawn. I looked at her. I thought about the load-bearing calculations I did every day at work, the precise measurements of stress and tension, the exact point at which a structure begins to fail. I had spent 13 years avoiding the equivalent calculation in this house, telling myself that keeping things calm was the same as keeping things intact. It wasn't. I didn't go inside that night. I drove to my brother Marcus's apartment on the east side of town, with 3 of the 6 bags in the back of my truck, and I sat at his kitchen table while he made coffee he knew I wouldn't drink. He didn't ask many questions. Marcus has always understood when not to ask questions. What I didn't understand yet, what I wouldn't understand for several more weeks, was that Claire hadn't spoken to a lawyer about the divorce. She'd spoken to a lawyer about the house. Those are very different things. Let me take you back. Not to the beginning, that would take too long, and the beginning is not where this story lives. But back far enough to understand what normal looked like inside that house, so you can understand what I missed and why. For most of our marriage, Claire and I worked well together in the logistical sense. We divided the house the way 2 engineers might divide a project, by aptitude and preference, without much discussion. I handled the structural things, maintenance, finances, the slow accumulation of decisions about the neighborhood and the property. Claire handled the interior world, the way the rooms felt, the colors on the walls, the way light moved through the house at different hours. She had a gift for that. Clients paid her real money to do for their homes what she did instinctively for ours. Owen was the center of it. I think both of us could admit that. He was the axis around which our family rotated, and for a long time, that felt like enough of a reason to keep everything running smoothly. The trouble with running things smoothly is that you can do it without ever speaking honestly. I was good at smoothing. I had been trained for it. My father ran a quiet household where conflict was treated as a kind of failure, something to be managed down before it got loud. I inherited that completely. When Claire was frustrated, I de-escalated. When she was unhappy, I adjusted. I moved around her moods the way you move around furniture in the dark, carefully, without turning on the light. Looking back now, that was the first thing I should have named. Not her dissatisfaction, mine. I had built a system for avoiding discomfort so efficient that I'd stopped being able to tell what I actually felt about anything. The first sign that something had changed came in October, about 5 months before the bags on the lawn. Claire had taken on a major residential project, a full interior redesign for a couple named the Forsyths, who had bought a Victorian on the north end of town and wanted it gutted and rebuilt aesthetically from the ground up. It was the largest project she'd ever managed independently, and she was consumed by it in a way I'd never seen before. I told myself it was professional excitement. She'd always wanted a project like this. I was glad for her. What I noticed but did not think about, she started keeping her laptop on the kitchen counter instead of at her desk. She started taking calls in the car rather than at the dining room table. She started going into the office at Patrice's design studio on Saturdays, just for a few hours, even though they typically didn't work weekends. I noticed these things the way you notice a smell when you enter a room, briefly, then not at all, because your brain decides it isn't important. Owen noticed something too, in the way 9-year-olds notice things, obliquely, without fully understanding. One evening in November, he asked me at dinner why Mom always looked at her phone when she was supposed to be watching a movie with him. "She's just busy with work, buddy," I said. He nodded, accepting this, because he was 9 and I was his father, and if I said it was fine then it was fine. I believed myself completely when I said it. That's not an excuse. That's just what denial looks like from the inside. It doesn't feel like avoidance. It feels like reasonableness. Claire and I hadn't had a real fight in almost 2 years. I had taken that as a sign of a healthy marriage. I understand now that it was a sign of a dead one, or at least a silent one. She had stopped bringing things to me. I had stopped asking. We had arrived at a kind of parallel life, sharing a house and a child and a set of routines without actually sharing anything that mattered. The Forsyth project wrapped in late January. I expected Claire to relax. Instead, she became quieter. Not sad, I want to be precise about that. Not the kind of quiet that signals grief. It was a considered quiet. The quiet of someone who has made a decision and is living inside it privately before announcing it to anyone else. I didn't ask what she was thinking about. I should have. The Saturday in February that cracked it open came accidentally, the way these things usually do. Owen had a soccer tournament across town, and Claire was supposed to drive him. She asked me to take him instead. She had a call with a new client, she said. I said of course. Owen and I spent the morning on wet grass watching him play with the focused seriousness that only children bring to things that don't actually matter, and it was one of the best mornings I can remember. When we got home, Claire wasn't there. Her car was gone. The house was empty. There was a note on the counter that said back by 4 and nothing else. She came home at 6:30. She said the call had run long, and then she'd stopped by Patrice's to drop off some fabric samples. I said okay. I still don't know exactly who she was with that day. What I do know is that when she came inside, she smelled faintly of a restaurant, warm bread and wine, and she hadn't mentioned having lunch with anyone. I noticed. I did nothing with it. March arrived like a verdict. Claire's behavior had shifted enough by then that I had started paying attention, not in any organized way, not with the cold deliberateness that would come later. More like the way you start listening more carefully to a sound in the walls of a house, not yet sure if it's serious. She was on her phone constantly. Not obviously, she wasn't glued to a screen at the dinner table. It was subtler than that. She checked it with a frequency and a posture I hadn't seen before, quickly, with her body slightly turned, the screen dimmed. And when she set it down, she placed it face down. She had never done that before in 13 years of marriage. I made a mental note and told myself it was nothing. The Forsyth project had officially ended, but she was still going to Patrice's studio regularly. When I asked once, casually, what she was working on, she said they were developing a new portfolio for a pitch to a hotel group in Columbus. Plausible. Detailed. The kind of answer that's hard to question because it contains enough specifics to feel true. I believed her. That's not entirely accurate, I chose not to disbelieve her. There's a difference. Choosing not to disbelieve something is an active decision, even when it feels passive. The first real crack came from Owen, which I should have expected, because children see things from angles adults have stopped checking. It was a Wednesday night. I was helping him with a geography project at the kitchen table, laminated map, colored markers, the specific focused pleasure of categorizing things. Claire was upstairs. Owen asked, without looking up from his map, whether Mom was going to Aunt Patrice's again this weekend. Probably, I said. Why? She's there a lot, he said, still coloring. More than before. She has a new project. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I don't think it's a project. I looked at him. He was 9 years old, coloring the Great Lakes blue with total concentration, and he just said something that landed in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. What makes you say that? I asked, keeping my voice even. He shrugged. She comes home different. Like she's still thinking about somewhere else. I told him his mom was just stressed with work. He accepted this in the polite, unconvinced way that children accept things from adults when they know the adult is avoiding something. That was the moment I should have taken seriously. Instead I told myself he was perceptive but 9, and that children sometimes read emotion into things that aren't there. I finished helping him with the map and went to bed and lay awake for 2 hours thinking about absolutely nothing, which is what I did when I was thinking about something I didn't want to face. What I hadn't yet connected, Patrice. Claire's best friend and business partner. The person who received calls in the car and hosted Saturday visits. The person whose studio served as both alibi and anchor point in every explanation Claire gave. I had trusted Patrice by extension. She was a constant in our lives, a presence at birthday parties and holiday dinners, someone I'd always assumed was entirely on the side of our marriage. I hadn't considered that she might be on a different side entirely. The second crack came 10 days later, from a direction I didn't expect. I was at Hargrove running load calculations on a commercial project when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. The message was brief: "You should ask your wife about the Donovan property." That was all. No name, no context, no follow-up. The Donovan property. I knew the name vaguely. It was a commercial building on the west side of town that had been on the market for months, a conversion project someone was trying to develop into mixed-use residential. I had no connection to it professionally. I stared at the message for a long time. I didn't respond. I didn't show it to Claire. I told myself it was probably nothing, a wrong number, someone with a grudge, the kind of anonymous noise that surfaces in small towns when people have too much time and too little to occupy it. But I saved the number. And that night, after Owen was in bed, I sat in my truck in the garage and searched the Donovan property online. Claire's name wasn't anywhere near it. But a design firm was listed in the preliminary development documents, a small firm I'd never heard of, with a Columbus address and almost no public presence. The firm had 2 registered principals. One of them was named Patrice Holloway. I sat with that for a while. Then I went inside and said nothing. That was my mistake, not the investigation, but the silence after it. I had a thread in my hand and I held it without pulling. I want to be clear about something. I didn't hire anyone. I didn't install software on her phone or follow her anywhere. What I did was quieter than that, and in some ways more devastating when it finally opened. I started paying attention to paper. There's a particular advantage to being the person in a household who handles the finances. Not because it gives you power, but because it gives you pattern recognition. I had always paid the bills, managed the accounts, filed the taxes. Claire handled her own business accounts separately. She'd insisted on that early in our marriage, and I'd respected it as professional independence. I still do. But our joint account told its own story if you knew how to read it. The transfers I found were small. Not suspicious by any individual measure, 30 here, 60 there, once $200 in a single week, all moved from joint savings into her personal business account. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would raise an alarm on its own. But the pattern was accelerating. Over 4 months, the transfers added up to just under $11,000. I pulled the records. I printed them at the office. I sat with them spread across my desk after everyone else had gone home, and I traced the timeline backward through the months: October, November, December, January, each month slightly more than the last, like something that had started as hesitation and become intention. The Donovan property again. I looked more carefully this time. The development plan, available through the county records office, public document, listed a project budget in the early stages of construction. The interior design contract had been awarded to a new LLC. Registered 2 months ago. Registered to Claire Marsh and Patrice Holloway jointly. Claire had formed a business. A new business. A separate business, with a separate partner, attached to a significant commercial development, and she had never mentioned it to me. Not once. Not in passing, not in the context of the Columbus Hotel pitch she described, not in any form. I sat with that in my chest for a full evening. This wasn't an affair. Or, not only an affair, not in the way I'd half expected. This was something else underneath it. She was building something. A separate life, or the financial foundation of one. She had been planning this while we were having dinner together and helping Owen with geography projects and moving around each other in the kitchen on Sunday mornings. The more painful realization, she was talented enough to do it. The Donovan project was real, the development was real, the business was incorporated correctly. She had built something solid, quietly, without me. And the part of me that had always admired her professional mind couldn't separate that admiration from what it meant that she'd hidden it. I called Marcus that night. I didn't tell him everything. I said there was a financial issue I was trying to understand, and I asked if he knew a property attorney. He gave me a name. He didn't ask follow-up questions, which is why I called him instead of anyone else. The attorney's name was Frank Delgado. I met with him on a Friday afternoon, brought the printed bank records and the county document, and spent an hour explaining what I'd found. He listened without interruption, asked 3 precise questions, and then told me something I hadn't considered. If she's been funding a separate business entity using joint marital assets without disclosure, he said, that becomes a significant factor in any property division proceeding. I asked what he meant by significant. I mean, it gives you standing. The house, the equity, the asset split, all of it becomes negotiable in your favor if she can't account for where that money went. I drove home in the dark. Owen was asleep. Claire was in the living room watching something on her laptop with her earbuds in, and when I came in she looked up and gave me a small, neutral smile, and I gave one back. I said I was going to bed. She said good night. We had become very good at this. 2 people moving through a house they'd built together, each carrying something the other didn't know about, keeping everything on the surface perfectly, precisely intact. I lay awake thinking about the word standing. 3 days after my meeting with Frank Delgado, I came home to the black bags. I've been thinking about why she chose that moment. The timing wasn't random, I understand that now. Claire was not an impulsive person. She moved carefully, measured things, preferred to act from a position of preparation. If she'd arranged those bags and opened that door and said I've spoken to a lawyer, it was because she believed she was several steps ahead. What she didn't know was that I'd been to see Frank Delgado. I went back to Marcus's that night and called Frank from his spare bedroom. I explained what had happened, the bags, the statement, the locked door. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Good. Don't go back in until you talk to me tomorrow morning." I didn't sleep. We met the following morning. Frank had already begun pulling property records and reviewing the financials I'd left with him. He was direct in the way that good lawyers are, not unkind, just precise. "The house," he said, "is jointly owned. She cannot remove you from the property without a legal separation order. What she did yesterday was legally meaningless in terms of your rights. Emotionally meaningful, perhaps. Legally meaningless." He laid out the full picture clearly: the joint ownership, the undisclosed business formation, the $11,000 in transferred assets. He used the word dissipation, the legal term for one spouse depleting marital assets without consent. He said it calmly, the way engineers use technical language, and I understood it the same way. This was now a structural problem. And structural problems have solutions. I didn't go to the house that day. Or the next. I let Claire believe she had more ground than she did, because Frank advised patience and I had learned, late and at cost, that patience was the only tool I had left. Owen was the hard part. Claire had him most of that first week, which was the arrangement we discussed tentatively and which I accepted because I didn't want him in the middle of whatever was about to happen. Marcus let me stay in his spare room. I took Owen to school twice that week and we stopped for hot chocolate afterward, sitting in the truck in the parking lot with the heat running, and he didn't ask many questions. He was quiet in the way children get quiet when they understand that something serious is happening that adults are not ready to explain. Once he asked me if I was coming back home. "That's what we're figuring out, buddy," I told him. He nodded. Drank his hot chocolate. Said, "Okay. I just want to know where you are." "I'll always tell you where I am," I said. And I meant that completely. The formal meeting happened 12 days after the bags. Frank arranged it with Claire's attorney, a woman named Susan Graff, sharp and efficient, who had clearly reviewed the same documents Frank had. Claire sat across a conference table from me for the first time since I'd left. She was wearing the cream sweater again, or one like it, and she looked composed in the same way she'd looked composed on the porch. But there was something behind the composure now. A tightness around her eyes. She'd discovered that I knew about the LLC. I didn't speak much during that meeting. Frank did most of the talking. He laid out the asset picture methodically: the house, its current equity, the transferred funds, the business registration. He didn't accuse. He just described. Claire's attorney spoke quietly to her at one point, and Claire nodded once. On the drive back, Frank said simply, "She'll negotiate." He was right. It took 2 more months. 2 months of documents and valuations and phone calls I didn't enjoy. 2 months of picking Owen up from school and explaining nothing and maintaining the particular stillness required when everything around you is in motion. Claire and I didn't fight during that period, not once, not loudly. Which sounds like maturity but was really just the absence of anything left to fight about. We had gone past that. The settlement gave me the house. Not as a victory, I want to be careful about that word. It gave me the house because the house was where Owen's room was, where his soccer cleats were lined up by the back door, where the oak tree in the front yard had a scar on its bark from last summer's attempt at climbing. It gave me the house because it was the most stable thing I could offer him, and because stability, I had finally learned, was worth fighting for. Claire moved to an apartment on the east side. Closer to Patrice's studio. Closer to the Donovan project and whatever came next for her there. She called in September. 6 months after the bags on the lawn, 4 months after the settlement, 2 months into the school year, on a Thursday evening when Owen was at soccer practice and the house was quiet. I was at the kitchen counter going through some project files when my phone lit up with her name. I looked at it for a moment. Then I answered. "I wanted to talk," she said. "Not about Owen. Just about things." Her voice was different from the composed voice at the front door. There was something uncertain in it. Not broken, Claire didn't break, she wasn't built that way, but unsteady, like someone who'd been walking in one direction for a long time and had recently stopped. I let the silence run for a moment before I answered. "Claire," I said, "I think we've said most of what needed saying." "I know I handled things badly," she said. "The way I did it. The bags. That was." "Yeah," I said. Another pause. I was looking out the kitchen window at the oak tree. The scar on the bark was still there. It would probably always be there. "I've been thinking," she said, "about whether there was a version of this where we." "I've thought about that too," I said. "I spent a long time thinking about it. And?" I was quiet for a moment. Not composing a speech. Just finding the honest answer. "I think we both waited too long to say the things that mattered," I said. "I was as responsible for that as you were. But the way things went after, the LLC, the money, the lawyer before the conversation, that wasn't something I could build back from. I tried to find a version where I could. I couldn't." She was quiet. "Owen loves you," I said. "That's not changing. We can make this okay for him." "I know," she said. Her voice was very small. "That's what matters now," I said. "I think that's what's always mattered most." We stayed on the line for a few more seconds without speaking. Then she said goodnight, and I said goodnight, and I set the phone on the counter. I stood there in the kitchen for a while. The house was quiet. The project files were still spread out on the counter. Through the window the oak tree stood in the early September dark, its bark scored from the climb that hadn't quite worked, still standing. Owen came home at 8. He dropped his bag by the back door next to his cleats, took off his shin guards, and came into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator with the assurance of someone who knows exactly where he belongs. "Any homework?" I asked. "Little bit," he said, pulling out the orange juice. "Math. After you eat." "Yeah," he said. He poured his juice and looked at me with that direct look he has, the one that misses nothing. "You okay, Dad?" "Yeah," I said. "I'm okay." He nodded, apparently satisfied. Took his juice to the table. Opened his backpack. "Some things you don't explain to a 9-year-old. Not because they can't understand, but because they already know the essential part, that you're here, that you're steady, that the house around them holds." That's what I'd learned, in the end, about load-bearing structures. It isn't the beautiful parts that matter most. It's the parts you can't see, buried in the walls, doing quiet work every day. You only notice them when they fail. I hadn't been that, for a long time. I was learning to be that now. What this story ultimately describes is not a betrayal in the conventional sense, no single dramatic act, no caught moment, no shouted confession. What it describes is the slow, quiet dismantling of a shared life by two people who had stopped tending to it and called that stability. Claire's decision to form a separate business, to move money quietly, to arrange those bags on the lawn before saying a word, these weren't the acts of a reckless person. They were the acts of someone who had been planning an exit for months, possibly longer. And that planning reveals something important: she had lost faith in the possibility of honest conversation before she ever had one. She didn't believe things could be different, so she built an escape route instead of opening a door. What's harder to see, and more important, is that she may not have been entirely wrong about the conversation. Daniel was a skilled avoider. He was good at absorbing tension, at keeping surfaces smooth, at mistaking managed calm for genuine connection. He gave Claire a partner who would never fight with her, and in doing so, gave her no real way to reach him. The stillness he thought was peace was partly a wall. But there is a point, and the LLC represents it clearly, where the explanation becomes insufficient. Whatever Claire felt, whatever she needed, she made choices that bypassed her husband, her son, and the life they'd built together. She used joint money to fund a private future. She let Patrice serve as cover. She arranged those bags before saying a single word. Those aren't the acts of someone trying to save something. They're the acts of someone who had already decided to leave and wanted to do it on advantageous terms. The most revealing detail in the entire story isn't the bags, or the LLC, or even the settlement. It's Owen, at the kitchen table, saying I don't think it's a project. A 9-year-old, half focused on coloring a map, saw what his father had trained himself not to see. Children aren't smarter than adults about these things. They're just less invested in the comforting interpretation. They haven't yet learned the particular skill of making something threatening seem ordinary. Daniel learned, over the course of those months, the difference between keeping a marriage quiet and keeping a marriage alive. He'd optimized for the wrong thing for years, and by the time he understood that, the margin for repair had closed. The settlement gave him the house. But what it actually gave him was clarity, about what he'd built, what he'd avoided, and what he was willing to fight for going forward. The house stands. The work now is different. What stays with me about this story is the image of those bags, arranged neatly, not thrown. That detail matters. There's a kind of cruelty in careful cruelty. It says, I thought about this. I prepared for this. You were not part of the planning. We talk a lot about dramatic betrayals, the discovered messages, the confrontations, the scenes. But some of the deepest damage happens in silence. In the things left unsaid for years. In the small, daily choices to smooth something over instead of speaking into it. Daniel wasn't a perfect husband. But he showed up, he fought for his son's stability, and when the door was already closed, he chose not to force it. That's not a small thing. Sometimes walking away with your integrity intact is the only victory that lasts.